There's a strange peace that comes with knowing exactly when your life shattered. For some, it's a slow erosion. For me, it was the moment I saw my name erased from the story we had written together. If this story resonates with you, share it to help us grow the Whispered Truths channel. Maybe your experience mirrors mine, or perhaps you'll recognize the warning signs I missed. Either way, you're not alone in feeling invisible in your own life. We were nothing but dreamers when we started, Tori and I. Our tiny Chicago apartment smelled perpetually of sugar and fruit, as we experimented with her grandmother's jam recipes late into the night. During the day, I'd haul myself to construction sites, my hands cracking from the cold or blistering from the summer heat, but I never complained. Every dollar went toward building our shared dream. Tori would be waiting, her dark hair pulled back, cheeks flushed from standing over boiling pots, eyes bright with possibilities. "Taste this," she'd say, offering a spoonful of something ruby red or golden. "I think this is the one." The way she looked at me back then, like I was the other half of everything she wanted to create. That's the image that haunts me most now. It's hard to reconcile that woman with the one who would methodically erase me from our shared history. I remember the night I told her about my father's motorcycle collection. Dad had passed the year before, leaving me his pride and joy, vintage bikes he'd restored over decades. "I'm thinking of selling them," I said casually, watching her reaction from across our second-hand kitchen table. "But Ethan, that's your inheritance," she whispered, reaching for my hand. "Those bikes meant everything to your dad." "And you mean everything to me," I replied. "We need a commercial kitchen to do this right. The farmers' markets are great, but we're ready for more." When the collection sold for $75,000, more than either of us had expected, Tori cried in my arms. "This is our legacy now," she promised, her tears soaking my shirt. "Everything we build will be for us, together." That night, holding each other on our threadbare couch, we couldn't know that success would turn the woman I loved into someone I wouldn't recognize, someone who would erase me from our story entirely. Our commercial kitchen was small but immaculate. I built the shelving myself, installed the equipment during weekends and evenings. Harvest in Home, we called it, a nod to the seasonality of our products and the feeling we wanted to evoke. The first time I saw our jars lined up at a boutique grocery store, with Tori's handwritten labels and the logo I designed, my chest felt like it might burst with pride. Success came faster than either of us anticipated. A food blogger mentioned us, then a local magazine. Suddenly we were scaling up production, hiring our first employees, moving to a larger facility. I cut back my construction hours to help manage operations. We were exhausted but exhilarated, falling into bed at night, too tired to talk but linking hands in the darkness, silently acknowledging what we'd built from nothing. The first subtle shift came about a year in. Tori started attending networking events alone. "It's just boring business stuff," she'd say when I offered to join her. "You've been working all day. Get some rest." Then came the store opening, our third retail location, where I showed up to find my name missing from the guest list. "There must have been a mix-up," Tori said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as the manager hurriedly added me. I stood in the corner that night, watching my wife charm investors and journalists, her designer dress a far cry from the flour-smudged aprons of our early days. Have you ever felt something slipping away while being told you're imagining things? Drop a red heart if you've experienced that gut feeling when someone's words don't match their actions. Eleanor, Tori's mother, had never approved of me. "A construction worker?" she'd said the first time we met, her mouth puckering like she'd tasted something sour. "Victoria was pre-law before she met you." She'd made herself scarce after our wedding, claiming the Chicago winters aggravated her arthritis. But as our business flourished, suddenly Chicago's climate suited her just fine. "Mother's been so helpful with connections," Tori would say, brushing off my concerns. "She knows people from her charity work." I noticed the changes in my wife, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The new wardrobe, the changed hairstyle, the way she began to speak differently, adopting Eleanor's mannerisms and inflections. But most troubling was the language shift in her interviews. My company, my vision, my brand. It's just marketing, she dismissed when I finally confronted her. People respond better to a single founder narrative. It's cleaner. But it's not true, I said, trying to keep the hurt from my voice. We built this together. She touched my cheek, a gesture once intimate that now felt performative. Of course we did, honey. Everyone who matters knows that. But they didn't, and soon I would discover how deliberately that narrative was being constructed. The financial documents were the first concrete evidence something was wrong. I'd been reviewing quarterly statements when I noticed a discrepancy. My initial $75,000 investment, previously recorded as founding capital, had been reclassified as a personal gift from me to Tori. It was a small notation, easily missed if you weren't looking carefully, but I was looking now. I began my quiet investigation, photographing documents, saving emails, building a record of my involvement. When I went to retrieve our original partnership agreement from the safe, it was gone. Tori claimed ignorance. Maybe we moved it during the last office reorganization? But the knot in my stomach tightened. The confirmation came while Tori was away at what she called a business retreat with Eleanor. Our home office computer pinged with an iPad message. Tori had forgotten to disconnect her devices. Normally, I'd never read her messages, but the preview text caught my eye, about Ethan's role. The full exchange between mother and daughter made me physically ill. We need to phase him out completely, Eleanor had written. The blue-collar backstory worked when you were small, but these new investors need something more aspirational. I know, Tori replied. We're working on a rebranding that focuses just on my grandmother's legacy. The lawyers say with the new structure, he'll have minimal claim if he ever pushes back. Smart girl. Always protect yourself first. I stared at those messages until my eyes burned, the screen blurring through my tears. The woman I'd built everything with was methodically erasing me, and I was about to discover just how far she'd go to complete my erasure. The construction accident happened 3 weeks later, a scaffolding collapse. I was lucky to escape with just a broken leg, 2 cracked ribs, and a concussion. I spent 4 days in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness due to the pain medication. When I finally returned home, propped up on crutches, divorce papers were waiting on the kitchen counter. I can't do this anymore, Tori said, not meeting my eyes. The business needs my full attention, and you need time to recover. It's better this way. I was still processing this when Marco, one of our original kitchen employees, called me. He'd been fired the week before, restructuring, they'd told him, but he wanted me to know what he'd seen. Mr. Miller, they came to the hospital while you were out of it, he said, his voice low. Your wife and her mother. They had papers they told the nurse you had asked them to bring. I was there delivering a care package from the staff when I saw them. A cold dread settled over me. I thanked Marco and began making calls to the hospital, to our company's legal department, to the bank. The picture that emerged was worse than I could have imagined. While I was unconscious, Tori and Eleanor had brought documents transferring all my company rights to Tori. My signature appeared on paperwork I'd never seen, let alone signed. The final blow came in the form of a glossy magazine that arrived in the mail. Tori graced the cover under the headline, Self-Made Success, How One Woman's Vision Built a Food Empire. I read the article with growing disbelief. Starting with nothing but her grandmother's recipes and her own determination, Victoria Miller transformed a kitchen hobby into a national brand. There was no mention of me, not a single acknowledgement of the investment that started it all, the nights spent building production tables, the delivery routes I'd driven when we couldn't afford shipping. I had been completely erased from our story. The moment you realize someone has rewritten your shared history to exclude you, cuts deeper than any physical pain. Comment truth if you've ever had someone take credit for your hard work or contributions. I confronted Tori the next day, my body still aching from the accident, my heart shattered beyond what I thought possible. I brought printouts of the forged documents, the magazine article, the bank statements, showing the reclassification of my investment. How could you do this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Was any of it real? Did you ever love me at all? To my surprise, she broke down crying, big, heaving sobs that once would have prompted me to comfort her. "It was Mother," she gasped between tears. "She pushed me into this. Said we needed to protect the company's image. I never wanted to hurt you, Ethan." For a brief, foolish moment, hope flickered in my chest. Maybe there was still something of the woman I'd loved inside this stranger. "We can fix this," she continued, wiping her eyes. "If you just sign these clarifying documents about the company ownership, we could even try again, together." I almost laughed at the transparency of it. Even now, she was trying to manipulate me. But then fate intervened in the form of a text message. Tori's phone, sitting on the coffee table between us, lit up with a notification from Eleanor. Did he sign? The investors are getting nervous about his potential claims. Tori's face told me everything I needed to know. The tears dried up instantly as she grabbed her phone, but it was too late. I'd seen the truth behind the performance. "Get out of my house," I said quietly. "It's my house," she corrected, composure regained, mask back in place. "The deed was transferred last week. You have 30 days to find new accommodation." I did laugh then, a hollow sound that scared even me. The next few months were the darkest of my life. I moved into a studio apartment I could barely afford on my construction salary, which was limited by my still healing injuries. Friends from our social circle stopped returning my calls after Tori spread rumors about my mental state, claiming I was unstable and trying to extort her. The few who reached out to check on me stopped after being invited to Harvest & Home's lavish 5-year anniversary party, a celebration of Tori's solo journey that apparently included an open bar, too tempting to refuse in favor of loyalty. I sank into a depression so profound it felt like drowning in open air. The betrayal consumed me, not just the loss of the business, but the realization that the future I'd built my life around had been an illusion. Some days, I couldn't find the energy to get out of bed. Others, I'd force myself to work despite the pain, returning home to stare at walls until sleep mercifully took me. One particularly bad night, after a bottle of whiskey provided no relief, I found myself going through a box of photos I'd grabbed during my hasty move. There we were in the early days, Tori and I at our first farmer's market stall, grinning despite the rain that had ruined half our inventory. Me building display stands at 2 a.m., sawdust in my hair. The two of us celebrating our first big order, dancing in the kitchen to no music. And then I saw it in the background of a photo taken in our home office, barely visible on the desk, the original partnership agreement. I remembered now, we'd framed it alongside our first dollar earned, a ritual many small businesses follow. The frame had hung in our first commercial kitchen, then moved to the main office when we expanded. Looking at that photo, something broke and reformed inside me. The man who had built everything with his bare hands wasn't gone. He was just buried under betrayal, and it was time to dig him out. The question that tormented me during those dark months was always the same. Why didn't I protect myself better? Was I naive to trust someone I loved so completely? I replayed every moment of our relationship, searching for signs I'd missed, warnings I'd ignored. Had Tori ever loved me, or had I simply been useful, a convenient source of startup capital and manual labor? I'd believed we were building something together, but perhaps for her, I was just a stepping stone toward the life she really wanted. Running into Tori at a restaurant crystallized everything. I'd stopped for takeout after a long workday, still in my dusty clothes, when I spotted her across the room. She sat with investors, laughing confidently, radiant in expensive clothes bought with money that should have been partly mine. Our eyes met briefly, and she looked right through me, as though I were a stranger, or worse, invisible. That night I made a decision. I would not be erased. Finding Diana Santos was the turning point. After being dismissed by several high-profile attorneys who didn't want to challenge someone with Tori's growing influence, I found Diana's modest practice. Unlike the others, she didn't flinch when I mentioned my ex-wife's name. Forgery and fraud don't become legal just because the perpetrator has a PR team, she said, studying the documents I'd brought. These signatures don't match your handwriting samples at all. This is amateur work. With Diana's guidance, we built our case methodically. We tracked down former employees who confirmed my founding role. We recovered deleted emails from company servers where Tori explicitly acknowledged my ownership. We obtained hospital records proving I was heavily sedated when I supposedly signed the transfer documents. Most damning was the security footage Diana subpoenaed from the hospital, clearly showing Tori and Eleanor entering my room with paperwork while I was unconscious, then leaving with signed documents. Sometimes fighting for justice means standing alone against someone everyone else believes. Have you ever had to stand up for your truth when no one believed you? Share your experience below. When the lawsuit was filed, Tori's team responded with predictable aggression. James Westfield, her slick attorney, called it a, quote, desperate attempt to capitalize on Ms. Miller's success, and warned me about countersuit possibilities. But evidence doesn't lie. As depositions progressed, Tori's carefully constructed narrative began unraveling. Former employees testified about my central role in building the company. Financial experts identified the suspicious timing of document alterations. The hospital footage left little room for interpretation. Tori's facade cracked during her deposition, when Diana presented emails between her and Eleanor discussing how to, quote, remove Ethan from the company history. Her composure shattered, and for a moment I glimpsed vulnerability beneath the ambition. Not enough to evoke forgiveness, but enough to remind me she was human, not the monster I'd made her in my mind. The court case became a minor media sensation, with business publications particularly interested in the ethics of founder erasure. To avoid criminal charges for the forgery, Tori offered a settlement, $3.8 million representing my rightful share of the business. Diana advised that I could push for partial ownership, but I chose the financial settlement instead. Some prices are worth paying for freedom, I told the court during the settlement approval. The money mattered less than the public acknowledgement that I had been a founder, that my contribution had been real and significant. In the aftermath, I discovered a new purpose. Using part of my settlement, I started a non-profit, helping tradespeople understand contracts and protect their intellectual property. Too many skilled workers lose ownership of their creations through legal maneuvering they don't understand. I wanted to change that. I left Chicago, buying a small lakefront cabin in Michigan that needed extensive renovation. The irony wasn't lost on me. Once again, I was building something with my hands, but this time, solely for myself. The rhythms of construction became healing. Measure twice, cut once, trust the process, build slowly but correctly. A year passed, then two. News occasionally reached me about Harvest and Home, how major retailers had dropped the brand following the scandal, how they were struggling to maintain market share. Eventually, I heard Tori and Eleanor were facing tax fraud investigations related to the company restructuring. Strangely, I felt no satisfaction from their troubles. The anger that once consumed me had faded, replaced by something like peaceful detachment. I had reclaimed my story, and that was enough. Last month, a package arrived at my cabin. Inside was a jar of jam, not Harvest and Home, but from a small producer I didn't recognize. A note accompanied it. Your recipe was always better. I'm sorry for everything. It wasn't signed, but I recognized Tori's handwriting. I opened the jar and tasted it. Sweet, with a hint of tartness. Not bad, but indeed not quite the recipe we'd perfected together. I poured myself a cup of coffee, walked out to my deck overlooking the lake, and watched the sunrise paint the water gold. The betrayal nearly broke me, but in fighting to reclaim my contribution, I found something more valuable than money or recognition. I found myself again, and the understanding that no one can truly take your worth unless you surrender it. The business we built might carry her name now, but the strength I discovered belongs only to me. If you've been through something similar, remember that your story matters, and no one has the power to erase it unless you let them. Would you rather have public vindication or private peace after betrayal? Comment justice or peace, and why you choose one over the other. Your answer might help someone else find their way forward from darkness into light.